Welcome to the Scholar's Nook, where you'll receive mindful tips for the budding scholar. My name is Dr. Nick Wolf.
And I'm Dr. Stephen Linenberger.
We are glad you're here today. Hello, Stephen. How are you today?
Doing great, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Today, I
Good.
think we should talk about differing scholarly paradigms and worldviews. Much of our ability to make sense of the world as scholars ties directly to the assumptions we bring with us to our research. And it's amazing how people can often see the same data and still arrive at two radically different interpretations of what that data mean. But this is part of this actually informs our internal sense-making apparatus, and it's because those are all built differently based upon our previous experiences in life, etc. We examine the world through differing lenses, and that is bound to have implications for research. So let's start. I'm going to actually do something a little bit novel. I'm actually going to share my screen. I actually have a couple of slides here because I think this would be very helpful for us to discuss, because we're going to be going through an article today, and it has some tables which I think will be useful for those who have a chance to view this. But if you're listening only, that's fine. You can still look up. We'll walk you through the tables verbally, but if you have a chance to see the video too, it might be very helpful for you. But to start, we're going to head and discuss a very broad and low resolution discussion of the history of how scholarship came to be. I would say that there are three big eras of scholarship: the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Now, in pre-modern, what is true is basically determined by what the institutions say, either the rulers or the religious leaders going on there. What they said was considered sacrosanct, and you couldn't actually easily challenge them. But through the efforts of people like Socrates and Martin Luther and other people who actually felt the need to challenge prevailing authority, we created the modern era. This came out of the Enlightenment principles of trying to find truth, and it's without regard to who is saying it, particularly those in power. And the modern movement came out of a birth by the disillusionment with power abuses and with the, let's say, unreliable dogma of what institutions have been putting forth. Again, this was Aristotle, the Protestant Reformation, Confucianism, the Enlightenment. These are all parts that created the modern way of looking at science and sense making. In this case, what is true is based upon reason, logic, empiricism, and using the scientific method. Altogether, this is called rationalism. But then we get to the third era. The third era is the postmodern era. And this came out of disillusionment with rationalism. And we'll get to the reason why that exists here. But basically, the postmodern perspective says what is true is based upon what we believe it to be, a socially constructed version of reality. Now, there's value in, I would say, the modern and postmodern ways, but I think, and we'll get into how those are applicable here, but it's important to have these three different categories in our minds so we have an idea of how this has evolved over time. With me so far, Stephen?
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, let's go to the next part here. The next step will be to just revisit the assumptions that social science brings. And this is every first year doctoral student understands these assumptions here: ontology, epistemology, sociobiology, and methodology. So ontology discusses how the nature of reality. And there's two different wings of this perspective. There's the subjective and the objective. So for reality, for the person who believes in subjectivity, is that reality is socially constructed and it's interpreted by the individual. Whereas the objectivist would say that reality is external to the individual and is observable by all. Then we get to the next level is the epistemology. It's the nature of knowledge. The subjectivist would be would state that knowledge is relative and that there really is no absolute truth, or if it is, it's not knowable by anybody. This is all called anti-positivism is the overall label of this. The objectivist, on the other hand, would say that using empiricism, evidence, hypothesis testing, etc., we can find the fundamental laws and relationships to understand the world around us. This is positivism. The third assumption social sciences has is about the nature of human nature. Subjectivists believe in voluntarism, that we all have free will and autonomy, whereas the objectivist is usually comes from a deterministic approach where they believe that humans are the products of their environments and have a lot less autonomy and authority and agency in making changes in their lives and the worlds around them. And then finally, we get to methodology. These are the tools and processes we use to perform our work as scholars and researchers. So the subjectivists would actually be interviewing people about their individual accounts of the situation and just like getting people to tell their stories. Whereas the objectivists would be creating quantitative measures and do rigorous hypothesis testing to try and find the truth through analysis. So is this all clear so far, Stephen? Any
Absolutely.
objection?
No, not at all. If I may, though, if we go
Please.
back and we talk about the the shift from authority, religious belief, dogma to the age of reason. Voltaire is one of my heroes in this area. He and just really, really quick as a tiny little history lesson, the age of reason came about to throw off the yoke of superstition in religion and more of a reasoned approach. But it didn't take long for reason to be hijacked and used by Machiavelli and people like that who said, oh, it just comes down to absolute rationality. But when you think of things in a totally rational, reasoned way, a lot of times what you expend is morality and common sense. One of the examples, one of my favorite books is Voltaire's Bastards by John Ralston Saul, and he points out that the final solution in World War II was actually an agenda item, and it took 15 minutes to decide based on a very rational approach in a meeting of a bunch of elite, Nazis sat down and it literally just one item on an agenda, but they were using an uber rational approach. John Ralston Saul calls it the dictatorship of reason in the West. We have to be very, very careful that we don't put all of our eggs in one basket because, when we rely too much on reason, I'll repeat it again, a lot of times we sacrifice morality and common sense when we focus completely on reason or positivism in this case.
This echoes with me a lot. I'm not sure if I've talked too much about. I have a writing group that I work with, collaborate with other folks on. About we get together. It's a book club where we write books. But one of the things that I do with this group here that I constantly harp on, I said, is the difference between head talk and heart talk. If you're talking totally about processes and those high level intellectual ideas, that is often useful, but not particularly engaging, and it doesn't really connect with humans on an emotional level. So if you over rely on the head talk without any heart talk, you get very dry and not very interesting writing. So I always tell my colleagues that if they're a bit too much on the head talk, I say we need some more heart talk in here so we can actually put some emotion in it, because you need both. If you don't have both, you're not going to have ideas that are worthwhile, but are also going to be they have to be informed by the human condition, which is doesn't require a lot of engagement with emotions as well. So I agree.
And this has huge implications for organizational research. I just read an article in Leadership Quarterly that basically said enough already with measuring traits. The head talk, like, okay, if you have these traits, you're going to be a leader. No, leadership happens in the moment. It happens in the
Yeah.
space between the leader and the follower. It comes down to behavioral aspects. And this article, it was an editorial that said, it's kind of a clarion call for leadership researchers to become behavioral scientists. So it implies what you're just talking about, the head and the heart, not just the head.
Very cool. So our next slide over here will be, we just finished discussing the assumptions regarding social sciences. We should now look at the assumptions that pertain to society that researchers come with. And there are two camps here as well. There's those who believe in a regulation disposition for society and those who believe in the need for radical change. So those who favor the regulation view, they see society as it tends toward unity and cohesion by and large, and that the society's role is to uphold the status quo so as to keep things stable and productive and everybody can participate. And also believes that by and large, the society is generally benevolent and generally legitimate. On the other side are those who believe in the radical change view that society contains within it a deep-seated structural conflict between various power centers, and that society tends to oppress and constrain its members, and that is not always externally in terms of tyrants or just or power centers, but sometimes even internally by the ideas that we've assimilated in ourselves. So there's a balance here too between two diametrically opposed view of the world. So in the first set of assumptions, is the nature of reality objective or subjective? And here is what's the nature of society. Is it corrupt that needs to be reformed or 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 rev, uh, have a revolution against it, or is it a chance for being more stable and benevolent and can just be improved through incremental changes versus a radical change? So now we have these two different axes, and this is what Burrell and Morgan in their article in 1979 melded these two different axes into this 2x2 matrix. And these define the four major areas of scholarly paradigms. And at the top will be the radical humanists, where it's believed in a radical perspective, but also believe in subjectivity. The radical structuralist is on the upper right, which is also believes in a need for radical changes, but it believes in more rigorous evaluations of the world as a whole. To the bottom left is the interpretist framework, which believes that a regulatory perspective on society, but more subjectively oriented. And then the bottom left or the bottom right is the functionalist category, where it believes in objectivity as well as a regulatory framework. Now, out of the modern era of scholarship, basically the functionalist paradigm was the entire game in town. And it's only until we got to the postmodern era that we opened up a bit more space for those other three quadrants: the radical humanists, the radical structuralists, and the interpretist. Does this make sense for you, for us?
Absolutely. Looks
So
good.
now, so now we've laid out four sets of scholarly assumptions that represent broadly divergent perspectives on how we perceive reality in our society. And that's pretty amazing, isn't it, Stephen?
It is.
And of course, when I were to say that the regulation folks say that society tends towards unity cohesion, the radicals will say, well, that's the problem.
Yeah.
we,
We're a bunch of
we
conformists. Yeah.
it's conformist, and that whatever illegitimate power centers are there is
Right.
the what needs to be up and in the first place. That's the whole thing. Um,
Right.
and,
Right.
and now again, these are four different categories, but these are not exhaustive, and this is pretty low resolution. So no one is ever one thing or the other. There's
Right.
crossover, in these various assumptions. For an example, I generally consider myself on the objective side of the list, but I strongly believe in free will, which makes me
Mhm.
far from a determinist. So there's a lot
Right,
of crossover there.
right.
Okay. So I guess, Stephen, I have to ask you, is this model familiar to you? Have you seen this
It is.
before?
Yeah, it was before I came to this podcast this morning. I was telling my wife when I was in my PhD program. I remember the first time that we tackled these scholarly paradigms in a class. And for all of the budding scholars out there, a lot of this is going to seem so dense and hard to absorb initially, but if you stick with it, by the time you finish your PhD, you'll be eating this kind of stuff for breakfast. It takes a while to get your head around it, but it's super important to understand, and it makes you a much more well-rounded scholar and researcher for sure.
And not to mention that it also helps to just laying out the lay of the land and laying the map out allows us to place ourselves here relative to
Mm,
others.
yes.
And that means that opens up the door to more collaboration between people who reside in different areas on this chart here.
And sometimes you change your mind, as you become exposed to if you don't know what you don't know, it's very easy to stick in your lane. Like I remember there's a big, discussion back in the 90s and early 2000s on which matters more the person or the situation in leadership dynamics. That's my field. And I was person, 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 and now I'm all situation. The more I was exposed to social psychological research and more of this, interpretivist paradigm, I was like, wait a minute, no, the situation overrides almost any traits or behaviors that the person has. If the situation, we find ourselves acting completely different than we thought we would in different situations. So that's one example, but it's really good to do some soul searching using these paradigms and really figure out where you fit in and where the overlap is, as you suggest, Nick.
Absolutely. One thing about the axis that matches radical change and regulation, folks who favor the radical change perspective believe that systems are inherently corrupt and are structured to maintain power and keep select populations in a disadvantaged state. So, and this comes out of the Marxist oppressed
Right.
paradigm, and these folks believe that it's not simply enough to simply observe, to learn, and to understand, that the role of scholarship is purposefully designed to advance an agenda to liberate people from oppressive power, whether it be from external authority or from the norms, values, and ideas we've internalized. So it's a very different perspective from the regulation folks who are trying to research and do inquiry to try and understand things, which can then at some point be mobilized for additional benefits later. There's a there's an activist element to that radical change perspective, which is it's a challenge for those of us who come from more of the regulation based
Mm-hmm.
approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to keep that in mind.
It is.
Okay, now in the interest of full disclosure, I myself am probably closest in the functionalist paradigm myself. I believe there's an objective reality that is more knowable with study, and I think that things were pretty well, and although things can certainly get better, our current society is pretty benevolent for the most part. So I prefer the regulation side of this chart. Uh, I hope our listeners are now trying to figure out where they might be on this chart. But Stephen, where would you tend to place yourself?
I'm kind of on that line between interpretivist and radical humanist. And based on my experience, I don't know, it works better. That paradigm works better when you're looking at cross-cultural and economic things. Like you realize that the way people in poverty see things is way different than people who are in the middle class, for example. Just letting the person who's in the milieu or the experience, letting the data emerge from participant observer and seeing how they interact and looking at more of the nuances. I think the functionalist side, and I have no problem with that, is really more focused on, like you said, an objective truth, certainty. The interpretivist is more interested in just letting the data emerge, and I'm more of a theory building guy. I think you're a theory testing guy. I'm more of a theory building guy. Would that be and either we need both, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, the theory testing part comes from part of my training.
as an
Those of you
engineer,
who maybe listening don't know, I spent 15 years as an engineer, so I have that training of trying to embrace rigor, and that informs a lot of how I approach research studies as well. So that's probably part of it, but I definitely appreciate the theory building as well because I never thought of myself as an artist until I started realizing that some of the ideas I bring do have a creative flair to them.
yeah. And that's a good point. And as an engineer, your engineering background, and I know people in that field too, engineers abhor variance. Variance is a bad thing, right? Whereas on the interpretive side, variance is, we love it. We like to see what's going on in that, what stories are to be told from that variance and the outliers, what's going on with the outliers and so on. So, I think it's like a lot of things in life. If you can find a good, healthy combination of these interpretations, the better.
Indeed. So you said that you straddle the line between the interpretist and the radical humanist thing, but I don't think either of us would consider ourselves radicals.
Right,
That
right.
being that being said, I do make an effort trying to understand their point of view. That being said, some of the biggest disagreements that we have in the academy occur between people from different paradigms. And importantly, when it comes to conflict, the disagreements are most fierce across the diagonals. So the
Yes,
functionalists have a real hard time with the radical humanists, and the interpretivists have a real hard time with radical structuralists.
true.
Now, while as a functionalist, I may not agree with the radical structuralist need for revolution, but at least we can agree to measure the problems and see how large a problem they are.
Mhm.
Whereas if I'm talking to a radical humanist, I'm talking to someone who wants to burn the system down and can't even show me the objective data to explain why.
Yeah.
Now, I want to be clear
Oppression,
that I
oppression is
find
their rationale. Yeah. Wait, go ahead.
so I want to be clear that I still find value in each of the paradigms, but since each approach prioritizes different things in sense making, communicating effectively across those paradigms can be a challenge. So, Stephen, can you give us an example of an interaction where, from where you sit in this chart as not a functionalist?
Yeah. I come at this from, social science background and leadership. So those are the examples I'm going to use. I think the structuralist, I think leadership really, it goes back to um, Foucault, who talked about power and knowledge, right? And how those two things are used. In organizations, power and knowledge often is used to oppress, manipulate, and it tamps down workplace democracy if it's used improperly. I'm more of a, I believe that workplace democracy is really the ultimate measure of leadership success. And yet we tend to tamp that down in the radical structuralist side, where it is more of a, here's the structure, stay in the structure, it's been well thought out. Same thing too with a lot of leadership theories in the radical structuralist mind. There's a prescribed set of behaviors or prescribed set of outlooks that a leader needs to have, but all of those theories, when we look at it from a structuralist perspective, kind of imply that there's something wrong with the followers. And so that's where the radical humanist in me comes in to say, we have it upside down. The followers should be the ones with the most say. The followers should set the direction, where based on my understanding of radical structuralist, it's the other way around. And I, I'm not a Marxist, but at all, but I will say that it is undeniable that, when we look at on society at large, we are really oppressed, through our consumer-based economy. Our voter turnout is abysmal. If we have 50% voter turnout in this country, we feel like we've really hit a milestone. And you have countries where people really do push back to the government. Their voting turnout is so much higher than our. And what's my point? I do feel sometimes that we are tamped down. We are, pushed into these conformist buckets, and it keeps us separated. Our language is starting to, contract. The nuance in language is starting to disappear. And so it's very easy to put people in the Democrat or Republican or conservative or liberal. It makes us very easy to market to. I have a jaundiced eye when I think about how, we insist that we have a lot of freedom of choice and everything, but I think we're being led around by the nose quite a bit by this structuralist paradigm.
Yeah, and admittedly, this presentation here is partly doing that because we're putting people in boxes.
Mhm.
But I think what we are trying to emphasize here is that these boundaries between these boxes are fuzzy,
Right.
and there is diversity in how you approach these things and transcending things. So we shouldn't. Again, I'm not a deterministic person here, so if you
Right.
find yourself tending toward one of these, that doesn't mean that you can't already have sympathies or some nuance in how you understand these things, approaching ways as well. And that extends to our political issues as well, is that there's a lot more diversity of perspective than simply the red or blue team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Although you wouldn't know that these days, that's the sad thing.
You only wouldn't know that only because for some reason the people who are on television suggest that's not the case.
Yeah. They like to pigeonhole us for sure. Yeah. True, true, true. It's easier to market to us if they can separate us. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But
All right, we'll keep going here. We're going
yeah.
to go ahead and discuss each of these different groups in a bit more detail here. So let's discuss the goals and the major theoretical concerns of each of these four groups here. So, and again, if I'm off on these things, let me know and catch me here. But start with the interpretivist paradigm, where again we believe in a socially constructed world. So my goal is to listen, to diagnose it, to hear your story. And if you apply that to the theory, you realize that the world is socially constructed. That is your theoretical mindset. And we're trying to understand is the process of reification. How do you make your thoughts real in the world? Okay. The next paradigm would be the radical humanist approach, where again the world is still socially constructed here, but you're trying to be made aware of the assumptions that serve powerful interests that you have internalized, and this is often given the label of a critical consciousness. And in this case, theoretically, you're trying to understand what are the deceptive distortions that exist that we are taking in, which allows us to accept these assumptions, these ideas that don't really serve us very well, and who benefits from us having those accepted ideas. The third paradigm would be the radical structuralist paradigm, where we identify the sources of domination and persuade others toward either reforming them or engaging in revolution to rid ourselves of those sources of domination. So from a theoretical standpoint, we're trying to figure out where the sources of the macro power centers are and what is it that is keeping us enslaved. So we're concerned about domination, alienation, leading to eventual emancipation. And then finally, the functionalist paradigm, we are looking to search for patterns that can be led to, it can lead us to useful, reliable, and testable predictions about the world. In that case, we're trying to unearth the relationships between different constructs and phenomenon, understand what's causing what, and allow us to generalize those theories to as broad a population as possible. Is this all making sense?
Absolutely. That's a good breakdown, Nick.
Okay. So this is where we're at this point, we're going to leave the actual article that I'm quoting here. I'm going to give you my take on the value of each perspective and what blind spots each perspective has.
Awesome.
So the value of the interpretive paradigm is that there are many aspects of human systems that defy measurement. And if you can't, and their insight is that if you can't understand it without really being a part of it, just why you try to embed yourself in their understanding, in their stories, so that you really can understand it from the inside out. The blind spot there, though, is that once I become really embedded in it, it's really hard to see it clearly. And that does make it difficult for us to study them without having our perspective colored by our affinity for that group. The
Right.
next group is the radical humanist paradigm, where the constraints of society, the norms, the values, the sanctions that we have between other members of the society, can put unnecessary and or unfair limits on how people want to live their lives. So that's the value that they offer. The blind spot is that sometimes social constraints exist for very good reasons and are necessary for the function of society. One of the common images and discussions that we have that comes from conservative philosophy is the idea of Chesterton's fence. Are you familiar with this, Stephen?
No.
Okay, so Chesterton, G. K. Chesterton was a philosopher, I want to say in England, I want to say in the 1700s. But he was saying that if you were to come across a fence that was built there, the natural inclination might be is that, well, this is just getting in my way. Why is it here? In which case you'll be inclined to tear it down because it's a roadblock for you. But Chesterton would say that if someone expended the effort to put the fence in, there's probably a reason that they did so. And you really should not take the fence down unless you understand the reason that it was put there in the first place. That's just a general bit of prudence that maybe the fence it was there to keep out invaders or to cause a break between fields or whatever it is, or keep animals on one side or the other. But the point is that if someone took the time and effort to do something, it was probably done for a reason, and it would be really irresponsible to tear that down without knowing why. And maybe whatever was happening at that time has since gone away, in which case it's fine to tear it down, but you shouldn't do that without knowing. So that's the idea there. But a lot of our social norms that we have, what society values, they aren't there necessarily to constrain human behavior because it's trying to just restrict people's behavior and autonomy. There's often other interests that are being served by those norms and values, and that you really should be very careful about messing with those unless you have high confidence it's not going to cause other problems down the line. Okay?
Got it.
Okay, the third paradigm would be the radical structuralist approach. And in this case, the goal there is to identify the sources of domination and persuade others toward revolution. And look at, oh, sorry, I've moved it. So it is possible for institutions in society to become corrupt. And when that happens, a revolution or some sort of reform is required. And the blind spot there is that many institutions are legitimate, but and if you replace them, we have no guarantee that what comes next is going to be even better. When you walk into an assumption that all authority is illegitimate, you're going to make errors, because this is actually part of their scholarship. They assume that there are no legitimate authority, and that can be very dangerous because sometimes people are in power because they're just the best at what they do. If it's a hierarchy of competence and skill, and then you may be the best person to be the leader. And if you cannot walk into a situation believing uh, uh, as a prima facie assumption that these people are corrupt, because that's just a bad assumption.
Right.
Okay. And then finally, the functionalist category. So we are the value of our perspective is that we make better models to better understand the world and how things work, and make better predictions. But the blind spot is that not everything shows up in a quantitative analysis, and that some things defy measurement.
True.
So each of these four different paradigms has some value that they give, but also have some blind spots. And it's by collaborating across these paradigms that we can try and make best use of the different value that each provide, while covering up the blind spots and addressing those blind spots so it doesn't undermine our research. So I'll finish up here with let me go ahead and share that again at that last page. Oh, never mind. Stop that. Okay, so those are based upon two articles, uh, Gioia and Pitry, as well as Burrel and Morgan, and I think those really do help isolate what these worldviews are all about. Okay, did I miss anything in that, do you think?
No, I think it was a thorough examination and very good examples. You mentioned Chesterton. I do know who that. He was like a Catholic philosopher, right? Was that?
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
I think he was like a Catholic apologist or whatever. But anyway, yeah, he's often cited for these sorts of analogies. But yeah, I think you did a great job, Nick, going over those.
Okay, so as I alluded to a little while ago, that practitioners from different paradigms often don't play well together. But that's unfortunate because each paradigm has unique insights into our organizational systems and challenges. And moreover, it's that natural tension between the different researchers' differing priorities that push both to do our job better. And I can give you an example that I had a DBA candidate, which you may be familiar with, who was pretty obviously situated in the radical humanist perspective.
I
And,
remember.
and as a functionalist, this created some tension between the two of us. And I had to constantly check myself to make sure that I wasn't relying too much on my own worldview preferences. At the same time, I had to insist on her broadening her perspective as well. And as we both continued to interact, that tension dissipated as we both understood what each other was prioritizing. And to her credit, she brought in her research and her research approach to be from a purely critical analysis to something a bit more broadly, have a broader view to it. And this what was really interesting is that later the script flipped. A member of the committee, as she expanded her view, suggested that we eliminate the critical piece entirely because the focus had shifted so greatly. So I found myself arguing on her behalf, demanding it be retained because she had broadened her perspective in good faith, and it would be wrong to wrest that piece away from her. So it's a different. It was an interesting relationship, an interesting experience for me. So good research is informed by multiple paradigms. That's what I'm trying to say.
It is, and it's really important, I think, when we're, especially coming from like radical humanism or whatever, we have to state very clearly upfront what our biases are and which lens we're looking at it through. It shouldn't be a trick to figure it out. You just put it out there. I think that's the responsible thing to do, and say, I'm looking at this through a, you know, um,
A
a
lens.
feminist perspective or something like that, because then, it's full disclosure, it's due diligence, it's super important for quality research to put those biases out front, or the paradigms that we're looking at the data through.
So a couple of general questions I'd like to have you jump in on here. So How would you say that one scholarly worldview is going to inform their research?
Say that again.
How would you suggest one's scholarly worldview
Oh, it
is going
was,
to inform their research?
um, well, it's definitely going to influence which methods they use for
Mhm.
sure. Um, you know, and I also think that I'll back out a little bit. It's like, are your goals to again test a theory to look at the connection between variables, or is your goal to um, to develop new theory and question our assumptions about theory? So that will help us determine which paradigm we want to come at it from. And we have to. I might be getting off track a little bit, but we might want to also realize that there's limitations to every paradigm. I used to have my mentor in the in my doctoral and scholarly journey was a hardline positivist. He was an empiricist all the way, and he used to um, try to insult me by calling me a postmodernist all the time. And I'm like, you have to, positivism is a dogma, just like, you got to be careful. You can't, no matter what lane you're in, don't put blinders on. Keep an open mind. You can get yourself. I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast. I went to a fireside chat that Bill Starbuck did at a Western Academy of Management in Park City, Utah, and he was a statistician. He used to be the editor for the American or Academy of Management um, journal. I mean, highly regarded, um, amazing guy. But his whole fireside chat was the insignificance of significance. So it blew a lot of people's mind, because that conference has a lot of empiricists and positivists, and this is coming from a great statistician who said, you know, and if the significance isn't changing much, or we already know what he said, that's when we have to go back into the field and start looking for new variables, new theories, all those exogenous variables that we don't even know are going on in the background. He used the analogy of a lot of these empirical studies are, it's like sawdust on the floor. We've just cut it down to such fine slices, and a lot of these studies are done out of expediency. They can be done quickly, and we can try to replicate things. He's like, no, we need to zoom out, take our time, go back in the field, and look for new variables and constructs to examine, which was music to my ears, because that's the world I live in. So this is an example of someone who is, you know, um, not being dogmatic, and who was really trying to, show how important it is to cross these lines and consider the other paradigms.
Absolutely. As a leadership scholar, how does one's worldview affect their approach to leadership, would you say?
Well, I think our worldviews, if we come from a highly functionalist perspective, we tend to view leadership in a more hierarchical um, way. That there is some kind of authority compliance thing, no matter what. Um, if you just do the following things, you'll be a good leader. You know, but let's take transformational leadership, for example. The 4 I's. If you just learn how to do the 4 I's, you'll be a great transformational leader. But doesn't a transformational leader also understand that not everybody wants to be transformed? There's some nuances there where it kind of leaves out the wisdom of leadership and being able to really read the room. And I think, coming from a highly functionalist side, we tend to be very prescriptive in how we view leadership and how to be a great leader. Now, on the side where I'm on, the more interpretive, I'm more interested in the followers. I'm more interested in the day-to-day activities. The mundane details of organizations really show us more about what's going on in a leadership dynamic than if we start with theory and then try to push that down through through the organization. I think it needs to go the other way. And, you know, across all these paradigms, you take a word like leadership and you have to say, what is it? It's actually an empty signifier. It's used for everything. It means everything and it means nothing. It's used as a verb, it's used as a noun, it's applied all over the place. And so no matter what paradigm you're coming from, you first have to say, okay, what are we talking about here? And we have to put a stake in the ground and say, this is a definition I'm working off of when we talk about leadership. And it's a process, not a person, those sorts of things. So we have to really question our assumptions even before we get into a worldview or a paradigm to look at the phenomenon.
You're talking about, again, it's kind of touches on the earlier discussion about head talk and heart talk.
Yes,
As a leader, you can go ahead have any high-minded uh, value statements you want to say, but if you're not engaging with people on an emotional level and getting to know them and actually building some bonds of kinship between you as a leader and them as a subordinate, it's very empty.
it
And
is
I think you need to have leadership is, I would say, as much or more important to be the heart talk or engaging on the heart basis than by the head space.
for sure. And a lot of leaders are not comfortable with that. And therefore they end up with, I have this super logical, uber rational approach to our vision and mission and strategy in the organization, but not one follower was included in that decision. And then they wonder why there's a disconnect and we have communication problems. Isn't it better to, I read an article the other day about, because there's so much flux in universities right now with, a lot of our university presidents are aging and new people are coming in. And I was reading up on what does it take to be a good university leader or a good university president. And this is in the Chronicle of Higher Education. They said the first year on the job, a new university president would be well advised to do nothing but go around and talk to people in the organization and understand what the barriers, the aspirations, what's working, what's not working, what's it like on the front line, what are we hearing from our students, and so on. And then create the vision and the mission in year two. And if you're using this, the front line and the people who actually do the work to help inform your vision and mission, then you have a higher likelihood that there's going to be alignment, there's going to be direction, and there's going to be commitment. And you're not constantly trying to push an agenda or lead by bureaucratic fiat, which we see a lot in large organizations. And it goes back to what I said before about workplace democracy. How much say do the people that we're asking to do this work, how much say do they have in their work life and in their processes? I'm as a leadership researcher, I'm amazed at how, you know, people are chained to processes. They don't even question the chain. It's just always been there. It's like, gosh, you could make your job so much easier. You could free up time to do more, but we don't, and that takes really good leadership to say, hey, really do pay attention to what you're doing and let me know how I can help to make it better, more effective, and use your skills at a more optimal level. We really have to question every assumption when we go in and do an analysis like that.
And if you are open to change, or at least you're advertising you are to the employees, you better be listening.
For sure.
The worst thing that you can do is advertise that you might be open to sharing some authority, and then whatever
Not,
they said, then not acting on any of that, because that's more demoralizing than having done anything at all.
yeah,
Uh, Very interesting.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. Now, if you will indulge me, I'd like to take a step back here, just take a bit at the broad view for a second here. Uh, as I think about these ideas here, uh, I think back to the civil rights era, and the advances that came out of the civil rights era came out of the radical structuralist quadrant. But rather through violent revolution, they effectively persuaded others and lobbied to get policy reforms passed. And for that, they're definitely worthy of praise. Because passing good laws, uh, through the passing of good laws, the disparate treatment of individuals based upon our immutable characteristics is now seen as wrong and is effectively sanctioned for the most part. And however, these days, there are fewer grievances that can be effectively argued with data than ever before. Not saying that they're gone, but there's fewer of them. And the people who are in that upper right-hand quadrant these days, at least in the West, have less to do, I would say, and because they're finding fewer examples of measurable differences between groups that can be persuasive, that requires radical change of these social structures. And as we say, the biggest disagreements occur across the opposite quadrants because the radical structuralist paradigm has won most of its battles, except against capitalism, I would say. The biggest conflict I see is between the functionalists and the radical humanists. At least that's how I see it. But
Yeah,
that could be my blind spot in the way. So you tell me, is there agreement there?
there is agreement. Absolutely.
So I guess the key takeaway upon that is that we need to be open to collaboration with people for different paradigms because that's how we solve problems together, especially the complex ones. And once the radical structuralists were able to convince the functionalists that functionalists were missing something, they combined forces to address those big problems, such as racism, sexism, etc. And similarly, once the interpretivists also convinced the functionalists that they were also missing some important aspects of organizational life that are difficult to measure. Together, they were able to collaborate and paint a much more complete picture of what was happening in our organizations. So I think it's just really important that we uh, understand where each person is situated and then try and find opportunities to collaborate because that informs all of us better.
Totally agree.
I guess the last thing I want to talk about is the implications for our DBA students here. This program at Bellevue is about building professionals that solve business problems while capturing those lessons that can be passed on to the scholarly community. But we're a practitioner-focused program. We believe in adhering to standards of rigor and solving practical problems. So we probably have a slight bias toward the functionalist school in that respect. That doesn't mean that you can't perform scholarship in other paradigms, but it does mean that if you begin your research design, you should do so with certain assumptions, and those assumptions should be well documented, and that you make a serious effort to interrogate those assumptions on the outside, particularly if you're on the radical side, I would say.
Yeah,
For example, not all disparities in outcomes between groups are necessarily the result of disparate treatment. That should be something we always have as an expectation to try and suss out what that source might be.
right.
Furthermore, if you approach your research from a radical humanist perspective, you probably need to have a pretty extensive a discussion of limitations of your approach. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's very fair. Yes, for sure.
So I guess in this whole conversation, what am I missing? What else we need to talk about? What concluding thoughts do you have for us?
Well, I think you did a great job of walking us through it. I think my main takeaway, and it's something I have to challenge myself all the time, is, to, you mentioned biases and blind spots. We have to constantly uncover, those biases that are leading us to a particular paradigm. We have to be very open-minded. We have to be dispassionate as scholars. And we have to accept that there are many ways of looking at things. And the best thing we can do as scholars is to serve our research subjects at the highest level we can by making sure that we are using a paradigm that matches, the need to to understand a phenomenon or interactions in organizations. And it's freeing when you do that. It's like you really do open your mind. I don't care. I have to do it all the time. I have very strong biases when it comes to certain aspects of leadership, but I have to be willing to accept that sometimes the other perspective might be right in this situation. So that's my main takeaway. Understand these paradigms as much as possible. You're going to find that certain ones resonate more than others, but they're all important, they're all valid, and we need to honor each one of those quadrants that you pointed out.
Because pointing things out, I just want to point out the fact that a moment ago you said that we must be dispassionate. That is a
Yes.
heck of a thing coming from an interpretivist.
Yeah. But as a scholar, we have to be dispassionate. We have to be very, very careful that we don't foul our data and our findings by allowing, the way we want it to turn out. It doesn't always work that way. And as a dispassionate researcher, we have to be highly objective with this stuff. And sometimes it doesn't work out the way we want it to. You have to let the chips fall where they may. That's what I mean by being dispassionate.
Right. I'll call back to an earlier conversation we had about those Bertonian norms.
Yes. Yes.
We can bring our passion with us to our work, but we cannot abandon our organized skepticism.
I like that. Yeah, and skepticism. I'm glad you brought that up because that's another thing. These paradigms, should really help increase our level of healthy skepticism. I remember in my master's program, a gentleman who ended up being my mentor said that if nothing else, I want all of you to learn to have a healthy skepticism when you look at the research and when you go out into the field. Have a healthy skepticism, be informed. That's not a bad thing, so it's a good thing.
Very cool. Well, this has been a very fun and I think pretty deep conversation, and I appreciate you talking with me today about this, Stephen. And I would thank all you folks out there for listening. And until next time, this has been Dr. Nick Wolf
and Dr. Stephen Lindenberger,
reminding you to think better.
Thanks, Nick.